One, two, and it's recording now.
All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Discover Los Banos. My name is John Cates. I'll be your host for the series of episodes as we progress through beginning with the history of Los Banos and all of the things surrounding Los Banos, including landmarks, activities, calendar of events, depending on what's coming up, and we'll try to do the best we can to cover everything. Ask people that if you do hear or know of something that I don't mention, make sure you let us know so that we can include that in future episodes. Today, I wanted to start off, as I mentioned, with beginning with the history of Los Banos, not just the city itself, but the whole kind of geographical location of Los Banos and its surrounding flora and fauna from way back when. My guest today is Dan Nelson. Please welcome Dan. Thank you. Dan Nelson was born and raised in Los Banos, and he's actually fourth generation in Merced County. As far back, he can trace his lineage as far back as the 1880s. And Dan's connection to Los Banos besides that is that he had worked with various water districts since the 70s and was recently retired as an executive from the San Luis and Delta Mendota water projects. So congratulations on your retirement, by the way.
Thank you.
Man after my own heart. He's also got 25 years as a volunteer with the Milliken Museum, which he's representing today. And he was chairman for the last 8. Very good. He's also a board member of the Merced County Museum. Merced County Museum?
Mm-hmm. Historical Society.
Historical Society. And needless to say, Dan is a wealth of information in terms of the history of the West Side, the Central Valley, and Los Banos. So let's start out, Dan, with, we'll go back before Henry Miller and Charles Lux, and let's talk a little bit about the history just before that, the Native Americans that were here.
Sure. Well, just as an introduction, I sort of organized my thoughts about the history of Los Banos in a couple of different categories, and I break them out of pre-railroad history of Los Banos and post-railroad, because once the railroad came through, that sort of established the site of where we are. But it's helped me sort of organize my thoughts on sort of the evolution of the development of Los Banos by breaking it out on those two categories, or those two eras, pre-railroad and post-railroad. On the pre-railroad, of course, going back to the initial inhabitants of the region, that would be the Ocut Indians and the Native Americans that were in this region. There was a very vibrant Native American community in this region along Los Banos Creek and San Luis Creek and the San Joaquin River and out in the marshlands. But we don't have a lot of history of the Native Americans of this region, simply because they were pretty well dispersed by the early 1800s. They were either moved over to San Juan Bautista, to the missions, by the Spanish soldiers in the early 1800s, or they took off and ran from the missions and went over to the east side of the valley. So on the west side of the valley, most of the Native Americans were out of this region by the early 1800s and prior to us having a lot of records. So really what we have about the history of the Native Americans in this region is mostly archaeological digs and that sort of things, and then extrapolating from what we know about the Ocuts and other parts that
Sure.
So that was that's sort of the Native American background.
And in terms of I just know from word of mouth that there is artifacts that are continually discovered up in the hills over here on the west side, that the Yokuts actually did a lot of trading with coastal Indians, because there have been beads made of abalone shells and some other things that prove that they were actually doing some kind of trading. Can you elaborate on that a little
Yeah,
bit?
there was a lot of communicating and trading between the different tribes, and especially, as you said, in this region, they collaborated quite a bit. It appears with, I think it's pronounced the Ozone tribes from the coastal and the coastal range Indians, and
Right.
I know that there's sort of this area up above, right up top at Pacheco Pass, and it's somewhere up in that area where you transition to the Yokut tribes in the valley to the coastal Native Americans, and so yeah, there does appear that there was quite a bit of trading going back and forth.
So some really good history.
Yeah, a lot of paths, initial paths over Pacheco Pass,
Yeah.
back and forth.
And of course, that leads us to the San Juan Bautista Mission influence a little bit further in that those paths were initially used. And did they use some? Did the Padres actually use guides, Native American guides, to come into the
Yeah,
valley?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
They mostly traveled with their armies,
Right.
the Spanish armies that accommodated them or accompanied them from San Juan Bautista. So Spain started developing the missions up and down California,
Right.
which San Juan Bautista was the nearest one to this region. And it was the San Juan Bautista mission Padres and the Spanish armies that accompanied them that had the initial influence, European influence on the Native Americans. And essentially what they were trying to do is a couple of things when they came over into the valley, and was to, number one, explore to see if there were any sites in this region that might be used for missions in the valley. And so there is a couple of expeditions to do that. And then likewise, they were coming over to recruit the Native Americans to come back to the missions and to Christianize the Native Americans. And so their expeditions were sort of a combination of those two things. And they were looking for different routes to come over the coastal range, and ultimately ended up from San Juan Bautista coming sort of a direct route right over the coastal range on a watershed of a creek that came out into the valley. The Padres used to take baths in that creek, and so they named the creek Los Banos, de Padre Arroyo. And so that's the initial coining of Los Banos as the term and the name for the region here. It was the name of the creek that the San Juan Bautista Padres took to get over into the valley.
And that was an encampment of a resting point before they traversed up to the top.
Yeah.
And then rested there. That's
Yeah, there were 2 or 3 sites that are sort of designated or acknowledged as being the baths.
Right.
So there isn't just one
Okay.
specific site. There's 2 or 3 sites that they used to stop.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's
And like you say, it camped there, bathe there,
Right.
and rest, and there are still some expeditions that go up to those. The Path of the Padres is a really great program from I think it's the state that puts those on every year
In the spring.
in the spring, and it goes up to the lower bath, and then you have the upper baths in the higher part of the watershed.
Yeah, I've been meaning to do that. I've been in this town since '89 and
Oh, you're gonna have
haven't
to
yet to do it. But I hear so many people that do it on an annual basis. They make it, they plan it on their calendar. That
Yeah,
they
it's
do
a
the
nice
Path of the
day, it's a
Padres.
beautiful hike,
Yeah.
and always good guides, very informative guides. And
That's
so.
interesting. Yeah, I love that. Maybe this next spring we'll be able to do that. I
I'm
don't
gonna
know.
have to do that.
Let's, so then, speaking of the pathway and finally following the creek, let's talk a little bit about the toll roads and the stage and the stage station and those kind of things from the late 1850s, and how that progressed into, or how that pathway progressed into those things.
Yeah, the initial Europeans that established themselves here, the initial European that established himself here was actually Francesco Pacheco. And it's from this person that Pacheco Pass is named, and Pacheco High School, and Pacheco Boulevard. It's all after Francesco Pacheco. And he actually established a Mexican land grant in the Monterey, San Juan Bautista area in the early 1800s. And then in 1844, he got the Mexican land grant that actually came over across or included the Pacheco, the lands of the coastal range of Pacheco Pass and all the way to the foot of the valley. And so he established the first adobe because as part of getting a Mexican land grant, you had to establish a residence and within that. And the Mexican land grant that he had was 44,000 acres, and he established the Gonzaga Ranch adobe. And that adobe is about where San Luis Reservoir is located today. And that he built that adobe in about 1844. He also built another adobe on the eastern tip of the Mexican land grant, and that's up at San Luis, the San Luis Wildlife Area, where the elk preserve is today. There's an adobe up there on Wolfson Road. That's also a Pacheco adobe as well, and was built about the same time in 1844. So it was Pacheco was the first European that actually had dwellings here on the western side of Merced County.
Okay.
We started seeing a lot more immigrants coming in from Europe in the 1850s, and generally some of the initial ones were Basque, sheep herders and cattle people. The Woods family, they came in the 1850s, and a lot of them resided up in the foothills, and we had schools up in the foothills that were established, but they started moving in about the 1850s, and it was mostly just for the pasture, the natural grasses and pasturing sheep and beef at the time.
Now, did they come over? Were they integral in creating the stage path?
Yeah,
at this point?
yeah, certainly had a part of that, or they were a result of the stage coming through. Is probably more likely. And there was a fellow by the name of Firebaugh. His last name was Firebaugh, and he actually put in the first toll road over Pacheco Pass. He established the first road, and it was about 1855, 1856 when Firebaugh established this. And the reason he did it was he also had a ferry across the San Joaquin River, where present day the small community of Firebaugh is located. That was called Firebaugh Ferry at that time. And he had a ferry to cross the river there, and so he wanted more traffic from the stage lines from the Bay Area, from San Francisco down through the southern part down to Los Angeles, and they would have to use his ferry. So he established a toll road on Pacheco Pass in the mid-50s, and very shortly after he established that, the Butterfield stage was looking for a route from the East Coast to San Francisco, and so they took up on Firebaugh's toll road and used that and established the first stage station out in this area, and that's the Lone Willow Stage Station that's out on Delta Road. And that was established, I believe, in 1857.
Now,
and so that sort of opened the stage lines coming through this area, kind of opened up things a little bit.
Does that building still exist?
The building does not exist. However, just within the last couple of months, the Native Sons of Golden West have established a marker where the Lone Willow Stage Station was, and it has a summary of the history of the stage station.
Oh, very cool.
And I'd encourage you. It's
about
a mile and a half just north of Highway 152 on Delta Road.
Okay.
Yeah, just on the right side of the road, about a mile and a half to the north. you'll see the marker, and yeah,
Wow, that's pretty neat.
it's an interesting spot.
So, and if I'm not mistaken, if you drive over Pacheco Pass on Highway 152 and you look off, if you're going west and you look off to your right upwards, that's still part of that stage road, right?
Yeah, you can still
still
find
see
the stage road.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a fellow, there's a fellow that is currently from the Gilroy area that is retracing and mapping the 5 different roads that were developed over time over Pacheco Pass.
Amazing.
And you still can, especially from Dinosaur Point, which is the tip, down to down to the reservoir now.
Sure.
You can trace the different stage roads. You can still find them.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
It's a great hike. It's a great hike.
I've always thought about walking the visible part of that stage road, but there's nowhere to park unless you parked on that one little pullout to get up there, and then who knows how many snakes and other things I have to do. So I'm not going to do that, but I just thought it would be really neat to see, to walk along there at some length and say, well, this is history that we're walking on.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So the Lone Tree Station, it was established where?
It was on Delta Road.
On Delta Road.
And it had three different, it was significant to the history of this region for actually 3 different reasons. Initially, the reason it was called Lone Willow is there were absolutely no trees here in this portion of the valley. The only place you found any trees in the valley were along the creeks, and even those were sparse. But also along the San Joaquin River. So whenever there were any trees, they became landmarks. And so there was a huge willow tree on a slough at this point that is now Delta Road, as I said, just north of 152. But there was this tree, and the early vaqueros who lived here, they call it Palo Solo, or Lone Tree. And ultimately it became Lone Tree when the Europeans moved in. The English word or name for it was Lone Tree, and ultimately it evolved into Lone Willow. But that is so at one point, it was sort of a meeting point for folks, because it was, a
visible landmark, right?
It was
Sure.
a landmark.
Probably seen for a mile or 2.
Yeah.
Sure. If there was nothing else out there.
That's exactly right. And actually, you could see it from Pacheco Pass. I mean,
sure.
And that's where, as an example, Dos Palace, two trees.
Right.
Essentially, there are, a couple of trees
Little
over
trees
on sloughs over in that area, and these became landmarks.
Sure.
So initially, it was known as a landmark. Secondarily, when the Butterfield stage came through, they put a stage station there. It became the Lone Willow Stage Station, and so the stop before it was Gonzaga Ranch, which is now underwater, the adobe that is underwater at San Luis Reservoir. And then the next stop was the Lone Willow Stage Station for the Butterfield stage. And so that was the second example of sort of the significance of Lone Willow. The third is, as the Europeans began to move into the area, they needed a place to trade. And there was, and ways of getting goods into, their land holdings and their homesteads. And the first store and trading post was at the Lone Willow Stage Station. And a family by the name of Crayenhagen were encouraged by the Wood family, who were some of the first pioneers of the region, to open a trading store. And they opened it up for a year or 2 there at the Lone Willow Stage. They were there a year or 2, and they moved to the east on Turner Island Road, where they could catch, a couple of stage lines. And then ultimately were moved to out where Volta Road is in about 1870, 1869, 1870. And they were able to get the first post office out at the Volta Road site, and that post office was named Los Banos, or Los Banos. And so other than the creek, that was the first time that the name was used for, you know, the region or a community or a post office, other than just, you know, it having the name of the creek that flowed through the region. So you can actually trace the origins of the current Los Banos back to that Lone Willow Stage Station as being the first by the Crayon-Hagen family, who moved a couple of times, but ultimately ended up establishing what is now Old Los Banos out on Volta Road.
Right. Well, that's pretty amazing. I
Yeah,
love that.
it's interesting stuff.
Just the chain of events that would ultimately bring the city of Los Banos to its fruition.
Yes.
So talking a little bit about the immigration from Europe, I know you touched on it a little bit, Dan. You said that happened in the late 50s, early 60s. The draw was primarily the grazing land.
Yes.
Now the grazing land didn't exist except for after the rain, the snow runoff, and basically it was the San Joaquin River that kind of shrunk back into its banks, right? I understand that the San Joaquin River would overflow its banks by miles
Yes.
during the wintertime.
Yes.
And so during the springtime is when the Europeans, the Basque and the other folks that came across, kind of elaborate on that again. Just give me a little more, I guess, detail in the European cultures that finally started coming into the valley over Pacheco, and elaborate on that again, the livestock.
Sure, yeah, and again, initially, you know, it was primarily for pasture, and you're absolutely right. The spring runoff of the San Joaquin River, it would come off of the Sierra Nevadas, and in the spring you'd have all of the snow melt and all of the rains, and it would come out of the Sierra Nevadas sort of channel. But once it hit the valley's flat. And you know, it would overflow the banks and just kind of spread out, and there were just, you know, sheets of water in the San Joaquin Valley. And once they subsided, and in summertime and in fall, where the flows, you know, would back off tremendously, they left some really good pasture land, you know, that they essentially had spread out over. So a lot of folks started coming in the 50s and 60s and taking advantage of that, and a lot of Basques started moving in. The Arbrua family is some of the initial Basque, and they're still here in Los Banos, and I would imagine probably fifth or sixth generation at this point. But a lot of the Basques started to move into the foothills as well as the valley, and then other immigrants came in and started homesteading about that time. Henry Miller himself, just to put things in a chronological context, he bought his first land out in this area in 1863. And so there weren't a lot of pioneers out here, you know, at that time, but there were some. He wasn't the first. But certainly once Henry Miller moved in and established himself, he pretty much controlled the region agriculturally, culturally, and in so many different ways. You know, Henry Miller left his mark on the development of this region. Sure.
Didn't he leverage, once he, well, let's go into I want to talk a little bit how he leveraged the vaqueros to help. Didn't he use vaqueros to help herd cattle?
Absolutely. He really prided the vaqueros and how good they were at managing cattle, how good they were with horses, etc. And so they became some of Henry Miller's initial cowboys, were the vaqueros that were already here from the Mexican tenure, you know, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s before statehood. But no, he really he enjoyed the work ethic and the horsemanship and their abilities. And so he had the vaqueros as being the initial cowboys.
Yeah, the initial cowboys.
Yeah.
So, in terms of European influence, so we've got the Spanish, the Basque, of course, Henry Miller representing the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
At what point did Italian immigration, was that about the same time?
Yeah, it was.
Italians
It was. There was, different families that started coming in from Italy. The Toscano family, Saramelli family. There's quite Negras. There's quite a few of the initial Italians that came into this area. Interesting. Most of them came from from the same region of Italy. There was actually a little community in the south central part of Italy called Gramintanova, and about 75% of the Italians that ended up in this region were all from this small community, and that was also a case that once they started coming to this region, Henry Miller noted their work ethic, and he recruited them through some of the Italians that were already here. He, would have them recruit additional workers that he would need to come in because he did like their work ethic, and so a lot of them came to this region specifically to work for Miller and Lux. So that's mostly how the Italians came to the region.
That's amazing. I mean, to think, and I'd heard that story before, that it was just such a small component of a certain region within Italy of folks, of the generations that moved here, and people can draw their lineage all the way back to there. That's actually a pretty interesting bit of history I don't think a lot of people know about. So let's talk a little bit about Henry Miller.
Yes.
In terms of what he did to really influence the change of what the valley had been to what he began to do in terms of his cattle empire and land ownership. Primarily, where he got the idea and how he began to do the irrigation and the diversion of, or redirection of water.
Yeah.
In the valley.
Well, a little background on Henry Miller, just an incredibly interesting person and intriguing personality. But he was born in Germany. He was actually born with the name Heinrich Kreiser, and he was raised by a butcher in Germany, and he became an apprentice at a very young age for learning the butcher trade. And so he picked that up at a very young age. He was kind of an out of place youngster growing up. He didn't really, although he was very bright, he really didn't like school. He didn't have a lot of friends. He just kind of worked hard at what he did, and ultimately he was just, he didn't feel a part of the community, didn't feel a part really of that much of his family, and felt just sort of apart from everything, and he left home at a fairly young age, 14, 15 years old. I think it was after his mother died. But anyway, he left home and was self-sufficient, spent a couple of years in, I think, Holland and Great Britain, and but ultimately came over to New York. And I think he was 17 or so when he did that. And at 19, he and a friend were going to come to San Francisco and take advantage of the gold rush. The friend was in the shoe business, and his friend's name was Henry Miller. And his friend had bought a ticket, and it was a non-transferable ticket, and his friend decided he couldn't go to San Francisco for whatever reason, and gave Heinrich Kreiser his ticket, and it was non-transferable, so the Henry Miller, as we know him now, took the name on of Henry Miller and got the ticket, came to San Francisco, and became Henry Miller. But initially he was Henry Kreiser. But that's how he got to San Francisco. He had like $5, here's a, you know, a young kid, $5, and he comes into San Francisco, and he starts working for, you know, a butcher shop there, and ultimately takes it over and expands, and within 5 years, he's, you know, buying $30,000 worth, you know, of cattle, and ultimately met Charles Lux, and they became partners. Charles Lux was another butcher, and Charles Lux was more of a financer and a banking kind of guy, whereas Henry Miller was a cattle guy, and so the partnership actually worked out pretty well for him. And ultimately, they didn't like the quality of the beef that they were getting, and so they decided we're going to raise our own, and started buying land to do so. And in 1863, they bought the Santa Rita Ranch, which is along the San Joaquin River, and used it for pasture, and they were able to pasture their beef out here in the valley, move them over Pacheco Pass, and then they had land from Gilroy all the way up to San Francisco, so they could just kind of move the cattle back and forth between here and their butchering outfits there in San Francisco. So, and ultimately, you know, they ended up, by the time Henry Miller died in 1916, I think he had 1.5 million acres.
Wow.
Yeah, and certainly a lot of the land in this region. And so,
That's an amazing. Actually, that's he was in the western region the largest landowner at that time.
yes,
right?
yeah.
So who innovated the building of the canals to actually drain the water?
Yeah, there was an outfit from some entrepreneurs from San Francisco that came up with the notion of building a canal system on the west side of the valley. And initially, they were looking at it for two purposes. One was for irrigation, but the other was for transportation up and down, and to move goods in and out of this region. And because the only way they had of moving goods, you know, on a large scale to this region was by steamship up the San Joaquin River.
Right.
And you know, the San Joaquin River was really volatile. I mean, it was either flooding or it was, you know, somewhat dry, and
Sure.
so it wasn't all that ideal, you know, for being able to move reliably, to move
Yeah,
goods
wanted
in
a
and
more
out of the
consistent
area. And so they were
network,
looking
right.
at this canal system to assist in doing that. They had to get an easement through Henry Miller's land to be able to build this canal, because he owned all of the land that they wanted to build this canal on. And at first, Henry Miller wasn't all that enamored with the project, but, you know, as part of the easement, he was able to obtain a certain interest in the company. And they started building this canal, and they finished it in 1871. And when I say finished it, it went from the San Joaquin River near Mendota, where Mendota is today. It went from there. It's the canal that actually runs through Los Banos. That canal that runs, you know,
Sure,
sort of
yeah.
across where the airport is,
Right.
and right behind, you know, the town there. It comes through Los Banos, and it dead end at Los Banos Creek.
Right.
And so at that time, but in 1871 is when they started moving the water through there, and Henry Miller recognized immediately the benefit that this was going to have for the region. And for a variety of reasons, the company didn't do all that well at first, and Henry Miller was able to become a majority stockholder in 4 or 5 years, and ultimately just took it over. And he developed, you know, the canal system all the way down to Newman, and other canals within the region. So he's sort of thought of as being sort of the father of irrigation.
Sure.
of this region.
Right.
He's the one that established all the early canals, and that we still enjoy today, and
Right.
still are used today. So this canal that goes through Los Banos, that was actually dug in 1871.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew that it had a significance, but I did not know that that was
Yeah.
originally Henry Miller's canal.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
So, So really, Henry Miller was the innovator,
Mm-hmm.
and Charles Lux was the bookkeeper?
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
the way it
that's pretty much it, or actually more of the banker and the
The banker.
financer. Yeah, he took care of the financial stuff. Henry Miller would go to him and say, hey, we're gonna buy this land here, go find the money. And so Charles Lux, and Charles Lux was more of, you know, sort of a hobnob kind of guy from San Francisco, so he took care of all of that, of where Henry Miller didn't like that part of society. He didn't, you know, really like the city life, and he liked it out here in the country. And actually established Los Banos as, you know, as his base. He had a house over in Gilroy that his family, and had a house in San Francisco as well, but his family spent a lot of time at the Bloomfield house over in Gilroy that he built. But he spent a lot of time out here on the west side of the valley, in Los Banos at both the Santa Rita Ranch, you know, east of Los Banos, but also at Canal Farm. He had a major presence at Canal Farm, which is now Espana's restaurant.
Sure.
Yeah, and that was an old Miller and Lux ranch called the Canal Farm, and he liked that ranch, and he spent a lot of time there, and he had actually established a lot of the buildings that we see here in Los Banos.
That's yeah, and in fact, one of the series that I want to dedicate is kind of that history of the Canal Farm.
Yeah.
What it was and all of that. And one day we'll get that series going. It'll probably be attached to the history series that we're doing, that we started today. What I wanted to do is kind of conclude this first part.
Sure.
And we'll continue part 2, which will take us into transportation, you know, how, you know, how Los Banos moved from the Volta location, and
Sure.
how we actually became this part of the city, or this where we are today, the city where we are today. You know, the initial buildings that were built. We'll talk a little bit more about the melting pot. There was a fire that occurred at some point, you know, historical fire, just like most towns back then. Everybody has at least one historical fire, and we had that. The rebuilding, the building boom, a little more detail behind the canals, the reservoir, and all of the prominence that came with that, and then ultimately where we are in the 21st century, bedroom community, commuters into the Silicon Valley, that kind of stuff. We'll get into that in part 2. But really full information, Dan, and I really appreciate you agreeing to do this interview and doing this series with me. And you'll definitely be used as a resource going forward, if you're okay with that. So what we'll do is we'll conclude part 1 right now. But I'd like Dan to kind of elaborate a little bit on the Milliken Museum, where all of the artifacts are, where most artifacts are in the history of Los Banos, are on display 5 days a week, 4 days a week?
6 days.
Go ahead. Let's go ahead and have you kind of
A plug for Milliken
Museum.
Great,
Milliken
great,
Museum. Talk
yeah.
about volunteerism, that kind of thing.
You know, we're really, really fortunate. A guy by the name of Ralph Milliken moved to the area in, I think it was 1913, and he actually was a graduate from Stanford, and he moved to this area to be an accountant for Miller and Lux. And he became just enamored with the history of both Miller and Lux and the history of the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. And he began doing oral interviews in the 1920s. And so he would get some of the elders of the region in the 1920s, and he would sit them down, and he would talk to them about, you know, their growing up in this region in the 1850s, 1860s, and 70s, you know, and as teenage kids of the original pioneers. And so he would interview these folks, and then he documented the interviews just meticulously. And we actually have 3,500 pages of these oral interviews. And they're just wonderful, wonderful stories about, you know, the development of the west side of the valley, and it's firsthand accounts of, you know, of that. And so that is the core, and that is the foundation of the history that we have of Los Banos, are those oral interviews. All the books and manuscripts that have been written all come from those oral interviews, and we've recently scanned those, and we can do searches, so it's a lot of fun.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, we get folks coming in and my great grandfather, I think, worked for Miller and Lux, and more times than not we can get a hit, you know, when we do a search.
It's amazing.
And so it's a lot of fun having that. And so Ralph Milliken is the one to credit for, you know, us having the archives that we have. They started he worked with the city to start the museum in the 1950s. I think it was 1956 is when they built a very small museum there at the park. And then in the late 60s, they expanded the museum and also built the nearby scout hut that's attached to the museum.
Right.
But it's Ralph Milliken that we have to thank for, you know, the core and the foundation of the history, and then we've just kind of built upon it. The museum is open 6 days a week from 1 to 4. It's run by, you know, all volunteers, and we have a good group of of 10 to 20 volunteers that help in various ways, and then we have annual memberships that folks, you know, participate in and help fund the museum through the memberships. But it's all funded by donations and membership to the museum. And like I say, we're open 6 days a week from 1 to 4, and I would encourage folks to come in. There's some interesting stuff there.
Definitely. And are you looking? Of course, volunteerism is a huge commodity that isn't met as much as we would wish. But could you use other volunteers?
Oh, absolutely. We encourage anyone that's got any interest in Los Banos history or any interest in participating at the museum for whatever reason.
And how do they reach out to you?
Yeah, actually they could just call the museum, and the phone number is 209-826-5505.
Okay.
And just call the museum, and if it's off hours, we have an answering machine, and if it's on hours, you know, and just let us know that at what level you'd like to participate, or if you'd like to participate,
That's wonderful.
or if you're just interested and
Yeah.
have questions about Los Banos history.
Right. Or and if you have any ideas, potentially of a great grandparent that worked for Henry Miller, or something like that. That is definitely a gem in this town that I don't think a lot of people are still even aware of today, as long as it's been around.
Yeah.
And the history is phenomenal for this location, for this town, and for the geographic location. I love it. So I want to thank you, Dan, again for agreeing to do this, and this will be continued as a part 2 and potentially part 3. Keep your eyes out for the following episodes after this one. We will do our best to get promote the release of those videos as they come about. And if we have additional items that we want to talk about in part 2 and potentially part 3, then we'll continue to elaborate on those as well. But once again, thank you, Dan. Thank you, the Milliken Museum. Hopefully, we'll be able to get some photos and whatnot and include. And by the time this video is produced, we'll have photos interlaced into that as well. At this point, thank you for watching. We are always looking for sponsorship and potentially ad space if you're interested in sponsoring the Discover Los Banos series, and we'll be looking forward to producing more of these in the history of Los Banos and just the regular goings on of this town. Take care, and we'll see you shortly.
Way to go, John.